At exactly 8:17 on a rainy Tuesday evening, Tommy Brown was rinsing a coffee mug he had forgotten on his kitchen counter when his old landline telephone rang. The sound startled him because the phone had not been connected to anyone important for years. It remained in the corner of his apartment mostly because he never found a reason to throw it away. Telemarketers had stopped calling long ago, friends used mobile phones, and his family preferred video calls. The landline had become nothing more than a relic collecting dust beside a stack of unopened magazines. Yet the ring echoed through the apartment with an urgency that made him dry his hands and answer before thinking. "Hello?" he said. The silence on the other end lasted several seconds before a calm male voice replied. "Tommy. I'm relieved you finally answered." The voice sounded strangely familiar, not because he recognized the speaker, but because it carried an echo of memories he could not immediately place. "Who's this?" Tommy asked. The man ignored the question. "You still keep the blue ceramic mug beside the sink." "Good. That means I'm on the right timeline." Tommy laughed nervously. "Very funny. Which one of my friends put you up to this?" Another pause followed. Then the caller sighed. "No one. And we don't have much time before the connection fades." Tommy glanced toward the apartment door, suddenly wondering if someone was watching him through the hallway peephole. "How do you know what's in my apartment?" he demanded. "Because I've stood where you're standing thousands of times," the voice answered softly. 20 years from now." Tommy almost hung up. The sentence was absurd, the kind of prank someone would invent after too many late-night science fiction movies. But something in the man's tone lacked the excitement of a joke. Instead it carried exhaustion, as though every word required effort. "If you're trying to scare me, it isn't working," Tommy lied. "Good," the caller said. "Fear only makes people miss details. Listen carefully. Tomorrow morning you'll leave your apartment at exactly 8:40. A woman wearing a yellow coat will drop a notebook outside the bakery across the street. Pick it up before anyone else does. Don't open it. Just return it to her." Tommy frowned. "Why would I do that?" "Because if you don't, she never meets the person she's supposed to meet. And if that meeting doesn't happen, I never get the chance to call you tonight." Tommy felt an uncomfortable chill despite the warm apartment. "Who are you?" he repeated. This time the answer came immediately. "I'm you." The room seemed to lose every sound except the steady rain tapping against the windows. Tommy opened his mouth but found no words. The voice continued before he could interrupt. "You're 38 years old now. I'm 58. You have a scar on your left knee from falling off your bicycle when you were 11. You still hide emergency cash inside the dictionary you inherited from Grandpa. You never told anyone that your favorite place in the world is the abandoned lighthouse outside Brighton because that's where Mom admitted she was afraid of the ocean." Tommy slowly turned toward the bookshelf. Inside the old dictionary, exactly where it had remained for years, was an envelope containing several folded bills. No one alive knew about it. His breathing became shallow. "Impossible," he whispered. "I know," the older voice replied. "I spent months convincing myself this call couldn't happen either. But here we are. And Tommy, this isn't why I'm calling. The notebook is only proof that you'll believe the next thing I have to tell you. Because tomorrow night, after exactly 20 years of silence, the telephone is going to ring again. Tommy barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, the voice returned with impossible certainty, repeating details no stranger could have known. By dawn he had convinced himself that someone had somehow gained access to fragments of his life. By breakfast he had rejected that explanation. By the time the clock reached 8:35, curiosity had defeated skepticism. He left his apartment 5 minutes earlier than usual and crossed the street toward the small bakery. The city moved with its ordinary rhythm. Commuters hurried past without looking up. A cyclist argued with a taxi driver. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the cool morning air. Tommy almost laughed at himself for expecting something extraordinary. Then, at exactly 8:40, a woman in a bright yellow coat hurried around the corner while balancing a paper cup of coffee, a handbag, and several folders. A slim black notebook slipped from beneath her arm and landed on the sidewalk. She continued walking without noticing. Tommy froze for only a second before rushing after her. "Excuse me," he called. She turned, surprised, and smiled with visible relief when she saw the notebook in his hand. "I didn't even realize I'd dropped it," she said. "Thank you." Her smile carried the kind of genuine gratitude that could not be rehearsed. She accepted the notebook, thanked him once more, and disappeared into the crowd before he could ask her name. The entire encounter lasted less than 30 seconds. Nothing unusual happened. No mysterious light filled the street. No hidden observer emerged from the shadows. It was almost disappointingly ordinary. Yet Tommy knew he would never have been standing there if not for the phone call. As he watched the woman vanish into the sea of umbrellas, another man approached her from the entrance of a nearby office building. They greeted each other with obvious familiarity before walking inside together. Tommy wondered whether that was the meeting the caller had described. He had expected a dramatic revelation, but instead he had witnessed something so simple that it felt more convincing than any spectacle could have been. The rest of the day passed in a haze. He found himself replaying the conversation over and over, searching for clues he might have overlooked. When evening arrived, he returned home earlier than usual. The apartment felt strangely different, as though it had become the stage for a performance whose ending only one actor understood. He stared at the old landline every few minutes while pretending to read a book. 8 o'clock came and went. Then 9. Nothing happened. Tommy sighed with relief and embarrassment. Perhaps the entire experience had been an elaborate coincidence after all. He stood to make another cup of coffee when the telephone rang. The sound was so sudden that he nearly knocked the chair over. He answered immediately. "Hello." This time the voice was not the older version of himself. It belonged to a woman. She sounded elderly, gentle, and slightly confused. Is Michael there?" she asked. "I'm sorry," Tommy replied. "I think you have the wrong number." Silence lingered for a moment before she spoke again. "That's strange. I've called this number every July 7th for 20 years. Michael always answers." Tommy frowned. "You've been calling this number for 20 years?" "Yes," she said quietly. "He asked me to. He told me that one day someone else would answer, and when that happened, I was supposed to tell him one sentence. Tommy's grip tightened around the receiver. Tell who? The man who answers, she replied. Michael said he wouldn't know why yet, but he would eventually understand. Tommy's pulse quickened. What sentence? The woman took a slow breath, as though reciting words she had memorized decades earlier. Tell him, she whispered, the last photograph is facing the wrong direction. Before Tommy could ask another question, the line filled with static. Then it went completely dead. He tried calling the number back, but the operator informed him that the number did not exist. Tommy slowly lowered the receiver. He had never heard of Michael. He had no idea what the message meant. Yet deep inside, he felt something shift. The first phone call had made him curious. The second made him realize he was no longer trying to solve a prank. He was stepping into a mystery that had apparently been waiting for him for 20 years. Tommy repeated the sentence aloud until the words began to lose their meaning. The last photograph is facing the wrong direction. It sounded less like a message and more like the final line of a dream. He searched his apartment for anything that might resemble a hidden clue. Every picture frame on the shelves faced outward. Every family album was arranged exactly as he remembered. Nothing seemed unusual. Around midnight, exhausted and frustrated, he almost gave up. Then he remembered a cardboard box stored in the back of his bedroom closet. It contained photographs he had never bothered to organize after moving into the apartment years earlier. He pulled the dusty box onto the floor and began sorting through hundreds of printed pictures. Vacations. Birthdays. University friends. Office parties. His parents smiling in front of a rented cottage. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary. Nearly an hour later, he reached the final photograph in the stack. It was lying face down. Tommy frowned. Every other photograph had been placed face up. Only the last one rested in the opposite direction. Slowly, he turned it over. The image showed his grandfather standing beside the old lighthouse outside Brighton on a windy afternoon. Tommy remembered taking the picture when he was 15. It had been one of the last afternoons they spent together before his grandfather became seriously ill. At first glance nothing seemed remarkable. Then Tommy noticed something he had somehow ignored for more than 20 years. His grandfather was not looking at the camera. He was looking toward the lighthouse entrance. Standing near the doorway, partially hidden by shadow, was another person. The figure was too far away to identify, but someone had clearly been there. Tommy was certain that he had never noticed the stranger before. He carried the photograph beneath the brighter kitchen light. The mysterious figure appeared to be wearing a long dark coat despite the sunny weather. One hand rested against the stone wall as if waiting for someone to arrive. The face remained too blurred to distinguish, but the posture felt oddly familiar. Tommy flipped the photograph over. His own handwriting covered the back. The date matched his memory. Yet beneath the date was another sentence written in ink he did not recognize. Don't forget to look behind him. Tommy stared at the words. He had never written them. The handwriting belonged to someone older, steadier, and strangely familiar. His telephone rang again. Tommy answered before the second ring. "You're moving faster than I expected," said the older version of himself. His voice sounded relieved, but also tired. You found the photograph. How did you know about the writing? Tommy asked. Because I wrote it. That's impossible. So is this conversation. Tommy looked back at the photograph. Who is the person near the lighthouse? I can't tell you. You already know. Yes. Then why not? Because every answer changes the questions you'll ask next. If I tell you too much, you'll stop noticing the details that matter. Tommy exhaled impatiently. You're becoming incredibly frustrating, I know. I remember feeling exactly the same. Tommy leaned against the kitchen counter. Who is Michael? Who was the old woman? Why did she keep calling this number for 20 years? There was a brief silence. I've spent 2 decades believing those were the important questions, the older Tommy said quietly. They aren't. Then what is? The person in the photograph. You just said you couldn't tell me who that is. I said I couldn't tell you. I didn't say you couldn't discover it. Tommy rubbed his forehead. Then at least tell me where to start. The lighthouse. The abandoned one. Yes. It closed years ago. I know. There won't be anyone there. I know. Then why should I go? Because something has been waiting inside that building since the day you took that picture. Tommy looked again at the blurred figure. What exactly am I looking for? The older voice hesitated longer than before. A letter. What letter? A letter addressed to you. Tommy laughed in disbelief. Someone wrote me a letter 20 years ago and left it inside an abandoned lighthouse. No. Then who wrote it? You do. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across years instead of seconds. Finally Tommy spoke. I haven't written any letter. Not yet, the older version replied. Before Tommy could ask another question, the older man's breathing became distorted by sharp bursts of static. The connection is weakening, he said. Listen carefully. When you reach the lighthouse, don't go upstairs first. Why not? Because everyone always goes upstairs first. And, the letter isn't upstairs. A loud crackle swallowed the rest of his sentence. Wait! Tommy shouted. Where is it? For a moment the line became perfectly clear again, exactly where you never thought to look. The call ended. Tommy slowly placed the receiver back onto its cradle. Outside, the rain had stopped, and moonlight slipped through the window onto the old photograph still lying on the table. Only then did he notice one final detail. Reflected faintly in the lighthouse window, almost invisible unless the light struck it at the perfect angle, was the silhouette of someone holding a camera. Someone taking a photograph of the person taking the photograph. Tommy left before sunrise the next morning with the photograph folded carefully inside his jacket pocket. The drive to the abandoned lighthouse felt longer than he remembered, as though the empty coastal road had quietly stretched during the years since his last visit. Thick clouds drifted over the sea, hiding the horizon beneath a pale gray curtain that made it impossible to tell where the water ended and the sky began. When he finally parked near the rusted entrance gate, everything looked exactly as it had in the photograph except for one unsettling detail. The ground was covered with damp sand from the previous night's rain, yet there were no footprints leading toward the lighthouse. The building stood completely alone, untouched by recent visitors. Tommy climbed over the broken gate and walked slowly toward the entrance, leaving the first trail of footprints across the sand. He remembered the older version of himself saying not to go upstairs first. Every instinct urged him toward the spiral staircase that led to the lantern room, but instead he remained on the ground floor. Dust floated through thin beams of morning light that slipped between cracked wooden shutters. The silence inside the lighthouse felt unusually complete, as though even the wind had agreed to stay outside. Tommy examined every wall, every shelf, every loose stone he could find. Nothing resembled a hidden letter. After nearly 40 minutes he began to suspect that he had misunderstood the clue. Frustrated, he sat on an old wooden bench near the entrance and stared at the faded photograph again. His grandfather stood smiling in the foreground while the blurred stranger waited near the doorway behind him. "Exactly where you never thought to look," Tommy whispered to himself. He looked around once more. The doorway. During all his searching he had walked through it dozens of times without examining it. He stood and inspected the heavy wooden door frame inch by inch. Most of it was solid oak, weathered by decades of sea air. Near the bottom, however, one narrow section sounded hollow when he knocked against it. His pulse quickened. Using the blade of a small pocketknife, he carefully pried away a thin strip of wood that blended almost perfectly with the frame. Behind it was a narrow compartment barely large enough to hold an envelope. Inside rested a yellowed letter sealed with dark blue wax. Across the front, in neat handwriting, were 4 simple words. To Tommy. Open alone. His own name looked as though it had been written yesterday despite the age of the paper. He hesitated only a moment before breaking the seal. Inside was a single sheet folded 3 times. He unfolded it carefully. The message was astonishingly short. If you are reading this, then the phone calls worked. Please do not try to discover how they happen. I wasted years chasing that answer and learned nothing useful. Instead, ask yourself one question. Why did Grandpa bring us here that day? You have remembered the photograph. You have forgotten the conversation. When you remember what he said before you took the picture, everything will change. There was no signature. None was necessary. Tommy recognized the handwriting immediately. It was the same older, steadier version of his own writing that had appeared on the back of the photograph. He read the letter again and again, but no forgotten conversation came back to him. His grandfather had told hundreds of stories over the years. Why would one sentence spoken beside an old lighthouse matter after 2 decades? As he carefully folded the letter, something small slipped from between its pages and landed on the dusty floor. It was an old brass key no longer than his little finger. A tiny metal tag hung from it bearing the number 217. Tommy frowned. The lighthouse had no numbered doors. He turned the key over in his hand. Engraved on the opposite side was a date that made his heart skip. It was tomorrow's date. Not 20 years ago. Not today. Tomorrow. Before he could make sense of it, his mobile phone vibrated in his pocket. The screen displayed an incoming call from an unknown number. He answered cautiously. A young man's voice spoke before Tommy could say hello. Mr. Brown? Yes. I'm sorry to bother you. My name is Ethan. I work at the Grand Harbor Hotel. We found a letter addressed to you inside room 217. The strange thing is, our records say it was left there 20 years ago with instructions that it should only be delivered to you tomorrow. Tommy remained silent for several seconds, convinced he had misunderstood what the young man had said. The crashing waves outside the lighthouse suddenly sounded very far away. Could you repeat that? He finally asked. Of course, Ethan replied politely. I'm as confused as you probably are. We recently began renovating several old storage rooms in the hotel. Inside the safe of room 217 we discovered an envelope with your full name written on it. Attached was a handwritten note instructing us not to contact you until July 9th, exactly 20 years after the envelope had been placed there. Our manager thought it was some kind of unusual guest request, so we've honored it. Tommy looked down at the small brass key resting in his palm. The number engraved on the tag matched perfectly. Is the envelope still sealed? He asked. Yes. We haven't opened it. The instructions were very specific. It belongs only to Tommy Brown. Tommy thanked Ethan and promised he would arrive before noon the next day. The call ended, leaving him standing alone in the empty lighthouse with the sea wind blowing through the broken doorway. 2 different clues had pointed him toward the same place before he even knew it existed. That was no longer coincidence. As he prepared to leave, his eyes wandered toward the spiral staircase. The older version of himself had only warned him not to go upstairs first. He had never said Tommy shouldn't go upstairs at all. Curiosity overcame caution. The staircase groaned beneath each step until he reached the lantern room at the top. Most of the glass panels had long since shattered, allowing the ocean breeze to circle endlessly through the empty chamber. Nothing appeared unusual except for a single wooden chair placed directly in the center of the room. It faced inland instead of toward the sea. Tommy approached it slowly. Carved into the backrest were 3 initials. D.M.M. Those were his initials. Tommy Brown Brown. Except his middle name was Andrew, not Brown. He ran his fingers across the carving. The cuts looked fresh, as though they had been made only weeks ago instead of years. Beneath the initials someone had carved another sentence. Some memories arrive late on purpose. Before Tommy could examine it further, his landline began ringing. He instinctively reached for his pocket before remembering he was miles away from home. Yet the unmistakable ringing continued. Confused, he searched the room until he noticed an old black telephone resting beneath the window. It was covered in dust, disconnected from any visible wires, and yet it continued ringing steadily. Tommy hesitated before lifting the receiver. "You weren't supposed to answer that one," said the older version of himself immediately. "You told me not to come upstairs first," Tommy replied. "You never said not to answer the phone." A quiet laugh came through the line. "You're right. I forgot how literal we can be. How is there a telephone here?" "Wrong question. Everything is the wrong question with you. That's because you're trying to understand the mechanism instead of the pattern." Tommy leaned against the cracked window frame. "Fine. Then tell me the pattern. Every message you've received so far was created before you understood why it mattered." Tommy frowned. "Meaning?" "The letter in the doorway. The message from the old woman. The hotel envelope waiting in room 217. They were all prepared long before you needed them. Someone trusted that. Eventually, you would. Someone meaning me. Sometimes." Tommy's grip tightened around the receiver. "Sometimes." The older man sighed. "Tommy, have you noticed what's missing from every clue?" Tommy thought for a moment. Names? Exactly. Almost nobody has been identified. Michael. Yes. Ethan. Yes. Grandpa. Not his name. Tommy stopped speaking. It was true. Every important person had remained strangely anonymous. Even his grandfather had never been called by his first name in any message. Why? Tommy asked. Because names create assumptions. Assumptions create blind spots. Then tell me one name. There was a long silence before the older voice answered with unusual seriousness. Tomorrow, when you reach room 217, don't tell Ethan your name. He already knows it. I know. Then what difference does it make? You'll understand when he asks you a question. Tommy opened his mouth to continue, but the older voice interrupted him. One more thing. What? When you open the envelope tomorrow, don't read the first page. Tommy blinked in disbelief. You expect me to open an envelope addressed to me and skip the first page? Yes. Why? Because the first page isn't for you. The line went silent. Tommy slowly returned the receiver to its cradle. As he stepped away from the telephone, he noticed something that made him stop in his tracks. The dust covering the floor of the lantern room was undisturbed except for his own footprints leading to the chair and the phone. But beside the chair, facing the window, was another set of footprints. They had no trail leading toward them and no trail leading away. They simply began beside the chair and ended beside the telephone, as though someone had appeared there long enough to make a single phone call before quietly disappearing. Tommy barely noticed the drive back from the lighthouse. His thoughts kept circling the same impossible instruction. Don't read the first page. Every instinct told him that the first page of the envelope would contain the explanation he had been chasing since the first mysterious phone call. Yet the older version of himself had never given a pointless warning. Every instruction had eventually revealed a reason, even if only after Tommy had resisted it. By the following morning he found himself standing beneath the elegant stone entrance of the Grand Harbor Hotel. The building had been renovated several times over the decades, but traces of its original architecture remained in the brass railings and tall arched windows. Inside, the lobby was quiet except for the distant sound of luggage wheels crossing polished marble. A young receptionist looked up from the front desk and smiled. "Good morning. May I help you?" Tommy almost answered automatically before remembering the warning. "I'm here about an envelope," he said. The receptionist nodded immediately. "Of course. You must be." He paused, waiting. Tommy simply smiled without speaking. The young man looked slightly puzzled before glancing at the reservation folder beneath the counter. "You're here for room 217, aren't you?" Tommy nodded. "Yes." "Excellent. Mr. Ethan will be right with you." Moments later, a man in his late 20s approached from a nearby office carrying a small wooden box. He looked exactly like the voice Tommy had imagined during yesterday's phone call, calm, polite, and slightly curious. "Good morning," Ethan said. "Before I give this to you, I have to ask one question." Tommy felt his heartbeat quicken. This was the moment the older version of himself had predicted. Ethan looked directly into his eyes and asked, "How do you know the envelope belongs to you?" Tommy hesitated. If he had introduced himself by name at the reception desk, the question would have sounded ordinary. Instead, it carried an entirely different meaning. Tommy answered carefully. Because someone expected me to come. Ethan studied him for several seconds before smiling. That's the correct answer. Tommy blinked. Correct? Ethan opened the wooden box. Inside rested a thick cream-colored envelope tied with a faded blue ribbon. The instructions said that if the visitor answered with a name, I was not to hand over the envelope. Only if the visitor understood the difference. Tommy stared at him. Who left these instructions? Ethan shook his head. I don't know. They were written long before I worked here. My grandfather was the hotel manager when the envelope arrived. Before he retired, he made me promise that if this day ever came, I would follow every instruction exactly as written. Tommy accepted the envelope with both hands. It felt heavier than paper alone should have. Ethan hesitated before speaking again. There's one more thing. What is it? My grandfather always said the man who collected this envelope would ask who left it. Tommy nodded slowly. And? Ethan smiled. He was told to answer, you already met him. You just didn't know it yet. A chill ran through Tommy. He thanked Ethan and walked outside, resisting the overwhelming temptation to tear open the envelope immediately. Instead, he sat on a bench overlooking the harbor where the morning breeze carried the scent of salt water and distant rain. Carefully removing the ribbon, he opened the envelope. Inside were several neatly folded pages. Remembering the warning, he deliberately lifted the first page without reading it and placed it face down beside him. He began with the second page. The handwriting was unmistakably his older self's. If you respected the instruction not to read the first page, then you've finally learned the lesson that took me decades to understand. Not every message addressed to you is meant for you first. Some truths belong to other people until they are ready to give them away. Now you are ready for the real story. Tommy continued reading. Everything began long before the first phone call. It began on the afternoon Grandpa took us to the lighthouse. You have spent 20 years remembering the photograph because photographs preserve images. They do not preserve conversations. Memory quietly chooses what it believes is important. Yours made the wrong choice. Tommy paused. Something stirred at the edge of his memory. The smell of the ocean. His grandfather adjusting his hat against the wind. The cry of seabirds overhead. A sentence. There had been a sentence. He could almost hear it. He closed his eyes. Suddenly it returned with astonishing clarity, as though it had never been forgotten at all. His grandfather had rested a hand on his shoulder before Tommy lifted the camera and said, "People think the greatest mysteries are hidden in places. They aren't. They're hidden in moments that nobody realizes are important until years later." Tommy opened his eyes. His pulse raced. He had not thought about those words in over 20 years. Yet they now felt like the key to everything. A folded card slipped from between the remaining pages and landed on the bench. It contained only one handwritten sentence. Turn over the first page now. With trembling hands, Tommy reached for the page he had deliberately avoided. He turned it over at last. At the top, in bold handwriting, were the words, "If you are reading this first, you are 20 years too early. Please give this letter to the young man sitting 3 benches to your left." Tommy slowly lifted his head. 3 benches away sat a teenage boy, no older than 16, quietly reading a book. As if sensing Tommy's gaze, the boy looked up, smiled politely, and raised an old-fashioned disposable camera before taking Tommy's photograph. The sharp click of the disposable camera echoed across the quiet harbor. The teenage boy lowered it, smiled as though he had simply photographed a passing seagull, and returned to looking at Tommy with calm curiosity. Tommy remained frozen, the first page still resting in his hands. According to the letter, that page had never been intended for him. It belonged to the boy. Somehow, 20 years earlier, someone had known that this exact meeting would happen on this exact bench at this exact moment. Tommy stood, crossed the stone walkway, and stopped in front of the teenager. "I think," he said carefully, "this belongs to you." The boy looked at the folded page but made no effort to take it. Instead, he asked, "Did you read it first?" Tommy hesitated. "No." The boy smiled with visible relief. "Good. Then everything is still in the right order." Tommy slowly handed him the page. The teenager unfolded it and read silently. His expression never changed, yet when he finished he folded the paper with remarkable care and slipped it inside the book he had been reading. "Thank you," he said. "I've been waiting for that." Tommy sat down beside him without asking permission. "Who are you?" The boy laughed softly. "Everyone keeps asking names." Tommy remembered what the older version of himself had said. Names create assumptions. He changed the question. "How did you know I would come?" The boy looked toward the water before answering. "Because someone told me that if I sat on this bench every July 9th until noon, eventually a man would hand me a letter instead of asking for answers." "Someone?" "Yes." "Who?" "An old gentleman." Tommy's heart skipped. "What did he look like?" "Kind eyes. Gray hair. Walked with a cane." He said he had once made the mistake of explaining too much to someone who wasn't ready to hear it. Tommy immediately thought of his future self. "When did you meet him?" The boy answered without hesitation. "Next year." Tommy stared at him. "Next year?" "Yes. That doesn't make any sense." "It didn't to me either." The teenager reached into his backpack and removed the disposable camera. "Would you like to see something?" He carefully wound the film forward and opened a small notebook tucked into the camera case. Inside were handwritten notes beside numbered photographs. Tommy noticed that every picture had been labeled except the last exposure. "Why are you photographing me?" he asked. "Because I'm supposed to." "For what reason?" "I won't know until the film is developed." Tommy couldn't help smiling. "You really expect me to believe that?" "You already believe stranger things." Tommy had no reply. The boy closed the notebook and placed the camera back into his bag. "May I ask you something?" he said. "Of course." "When the phone rings now, are you still surprised?" Tommy felt an unexpected chill. "How do you know about the phone calls?" The teenager shrugged. Nobody told me about them. I guessed. How? Because people who receive impossible letters usually receive impossible phone calls first. Tommy looked at him more carefully. The boy couldn't have been older than 16, yet he spoke with a quiet confidence that reminded Tommy of someone. Not his future self. Someone else. Someone from much earlier. Then he realized what it was. The boy had his grandfather's habit of pausing before important sentences, as though weighing every word before allowing it into the world. Have we met before? Tommy asked. The teenager smiled. Not yet. Before Tommy could press further, the boy stood and slung his backpack over one shoulder. I have to catch my train. Wait. Yes. Will I ever see you again? The boy considered the question for a long moment. That depends. On what? Whether you decide to answer the final phone call. Tommy frowned. Final phone call. There are 7 in total. Tommy's expression changed instantly. I've only received 4. The teenager nodded. I know. How do you know that? Because if you had already answered the 7th one. He stopped speaking and smiled almost apologetically. We wouldn't be having this conversation. He turned and began walking toward the station without another word. Tommy watched him disappear into the afternoon crowd until only the memory of the disposable camera remained. Then something occurred to him. He hurried after the boy, but the platform was already empty. The train had departed only moments earlier. Breathing heavily, Tommy returned to the harbor bench. There, where the teenager had been sitting, lay a single object he was certain had not been there before. It was the disposable camera. Attached to it was a small handwritten note. Please develop the film exactly 20 years from today. Tommy picked up the disposable camera with both hands as though it were made of glass. The handwritten note was unmistakably recent, yet the camera itself had been manufactured decades earlier. He turned it over carefully. The exposure counter showed 27, meaning there was only one photograph left to take before the roll was complete. The boy had photographed Tommy only minutes earlier, so the counter should have read 28. Unless the camera had somehow advanced by itself, something did not fit. Tommy resisted the urge to press the shutter. The note had been precise. Please develop the film exactly 20 years from today. After everything that had happened, ignoring another instruction no longer seemed wise. He slipped the camera into his backpack and walked slowly along the harbor. For the first time since the mysterious phone calls had begun, he stopped trying to force the clues into a logical sequence. They did not behave like pieces of a puzzle. They behaved like memories arriving out of order. Every answer seemed to belong to a different point in time, yet together they formed something that felt complete just beyond his reach. That evening, as he entered his apartment, he noticed that the old landline was already ringing. He answered before the second ring. You met him, said the older version of himself. Yes, and you gave him the page. Yes, did you read it first? No. A quiet breath of relief came through the receiver. Good, the older Tommy replied. I was never completely certain you'd trust me. Tommy sat beside the window. I have a question. I know. The boy. Yes. Who is he? The older voice remained silent. You promised fewer riddles. I promised better questions. Tommy closed his eyes. Fine. Why is he important? Because he's the only person in this story who never asks for proof. Tommy thought back to the teenager's calm expression. It was true. The boy had accepted every impossible event without demanding an explanation. He simply believed. No, the older Tommy corrected gently. There's a difference between believing and paying attention. He paid attention. Tommy looked toward the disposable camera resting on the table. Why must I wait 20 years to develop the film? Because if you see those photographs now, you'll spend the next 20 years trying to prevent them. And that's bad. I tried. The words were spoken so quietly that Tommy almost missed them. What happened? I discovered that preventing the future isn't nearly as dangerous as misunderstanding it. Tommy frowned. I don't understand. No. Another brief silence followed before the older Tommy spoke again. Open the kitchen drawer. Tommy stood and pulled open the drawer beneath the counter. Inside lay the usual collection of utensils, spare batteries, and unopened envelopes. Nothing unusual. Lift the drawer out completely, the older voice said. Tommy removed it from its runners. Beneath the empty space, taped to the wooden frame, was a tiny silver key. He stared at it. That wasn't there yesterday. Yes, it was. I checked every drawer. You checked inside them. Tommy carefully peeled away the tape. A small paper tag hung from the key. Unlike the previous key, this one had no number. Instead, it carried a single sentence. For the mailbox that has no address. Tommy sighed. There's another mailbox, isn't there? Yes. Where? You've walked past it hundreds of times. I don't remember seeing it. You weren't supposed to. Tommy laughed despite himself. I used to think you were mysterious because you enjoyed it, and now I think you're mysterious because you're terrified of saying one sentence too many. The older Tommy was quiet for several moments. That's exactly right. The honesty of the answer surprised Tommy more than any riddle had. Finally he asked the question that had been waiting since the beginning. When this is over, do you disappear? The reply came almost immediately. No. So what happens? You stop needing me. Before Tommy could respond, the familiar burst of static returned, stronger than ever. The older voice became distant. The next call will not be from me. What? Listen carefully. I'm listening. When the telephone rings tomorrow. Static swallowed half the sentence. Don't answer immediately. The connection crackled violently. Count to. The rest vanished. Count to what? Tommy shouted. The line was dead. He slowly placed the receiver back onto its cradle. The apartment fell silent once again. Only then did he notice something unusual on the hallway wall opposite the kitchen. A narrow metal mailbox had been mounted there. It was old, painted dark green, and covered with a thin layer of dust. Tommy stared at it in disbelief. He had lived in the apartment for 8 years. He had walked past that exact wall thousands of times, yet he could not honestly remember ever seeing the mailbox before. Tommy approached the narrow green mailbox cautiously, as though getting too close might cause it to disappear. It was firmly attached to the wall, its paint faded by age, with tiny scratches around the keyhole suggesting it had been opened countless times. Yet he could not remember noticing it even once during the 8 years he had lived in the apartment. He reached into his pocket, removed the small silver key, and slid it into the lock. It turned effortlessly. The metal door opened with a soft click. Inside rested only one object, a plain white envelope without a stamp, without an address, and without a name. Tommy lifted it carefully. It felt unusually light. As soon as the envelope left the mailbox, he heard a faint mechanical sound behind him. Turning around, He watched the empty mailbox quietly swing shut on its own. He opened the envelope. Instead of a letter, he found a folded sheet containing nothing but dates. Every date represented July 9th of a different year. Some were in the past. Others had not yet arrived. Beside each date appeared a single handwritten word. Wait. Listen. Walk. Smile. Leave. Answer. Most of the words were ordinary, almost disappointingly simple. Only the final date had no instruction beside it. Instead, someone had written a question. Did you finally notice? Tommy read the list repeatedly, convinced that some hidden code connected the dates and the words. Nothing revealed itself. Then he noticed that one of the past dates matched the day his grandfather had taken him to the lighthouse. The instruction beside that date was not photograph or remember. It simply read listen. Tommy closed his eyes. Once again, his grandfather's forgotten sentence echoed in his memory. People think the greatest mysteries are hidden in places. They aren't. They're hidden in moments that nobody realizes are important until years later. For the first time, Tommy understood why every clue had focused on conversations instead of locations. The lighthouse had never been the mystery. The hotel had never been the mystery. Even the phone calls were not the mystery. The mystery was attention itself. The people who noticed the right moment seemed able to pass something forward through time without changing history. His thoughts were interrupted by the sharp ring of the landline. He instinctively took one step toward it before stopping. The older version of himself had given one final instruction. Don't answer immediately. Tommy stood perfectly still. One ring. 2. 3. He almost reached for the receiver. 4. 5. He suddenly remembered the unfinished sentence. Count to. Count to what? 6. 10. 20. The telephone continued ringing with patient determination. Tommy decided to trust the rhythm instead of guessing the number. He counted slowly under his breath. 1. 2. 3. 4. 5. 6. 7. At the 8th count, the ringing stopped. The apartment became completely silent. Tommy stared at the telephone, convinced he had made the wrong decision. Then, exactly 5 seconds later, it rang again. He answered immediately. Perfect, said a calm female voice. It was not the elderly woman from before. This voice sounded younger, perhaps in her 40s, clear and confident. You waited. Tommy remained cautious. Who are you? Someone who once answered too early. Do you know me? Not yet. Tommy smiled despite himself. He had heard that answer before. You sound as if you've met the others. Some of them. My older self. Yes. The boy. A brief pause followed. Only in photographs. Tommy's heartbeat quickened. What photographs? The ones you're going to develop in 20 years. Tommy leaned against the wall. Everyone keeps talking about those photographs. What's on them? If I told you, you would spend the next 20 years looking at the pictures instead of seeing the moments. Tommy almost laughed. Every answer somehow managed to reveal less while making more sense. "Then why are you calling?" he asked. The woman's tone became unexpectedly gentle. "Because someone needs to tell you what nobody told me." "Which is?" "You've been assuming that all these messages were sent to change your future." Tommy frowned. "Weren't they?" "No." "Then what are they for?" The woman took a slow breath before answering. "They're there so that, when the time comes, you'll recognize the moment in which you become the first person to make the very first phone call." Tommy felt the room spin slightly. Until that instant, he had always imagined himself as the receiver of a chain of messages begun by someone else. The possibility that he might actually be the one who started everything had never crossed his mind. Before he could ask another question, the woman added one final sentence. "When the last phone rings, don't ask who you're calling. Ask who has been waiting to answer." The line went dead. Tommy slowly lowered the receiver. On the kitchen table, beside the envelope of dates, lay something that had not been there a moment earlier. It was a brand new sheet of paper. Across the top, in his own handwriting, was the title, "The Script for the First Phone Call." Tommy stared at the title for a long time without touching the pages beneath it. The script for the first phone call. Every instinct urged him to unfold the document immediately, yet he had learned that haste was the only real enemy in this strange journey. He sat beside the silent telephone and waited until his breathing slowed. Only then did he lift the first page. It contained no complicated diagrams, no explanation of time, and no impossible scientific theory. Instead, it began with a single sentence. "If you are reading this, you have finally stopped asking how and started asking why." Tommy smiled. It was true. Somewhere along the way, his obsession with impossible mechanics had quietly disappeared. He no longer cared how voices crossed decades or how letters arrived before they were written. What mattered was what they had accomplished. They had taught him to notice moments that would otherwise have passed unnoticed. He continued reading. "You once believed that every phone call was trying to change your future. That was never the purpose. The future has always been capable of taking care of itself. What changes is the person who arrives there. 20 years from now you will receive an opportunity that almost everyone would ignore because it will appear completely ordinary. If you are the same man who answered the first call, you will miss it. If you are the man who finishes reading this letter, you will recognize it immediately." Tommy reached the final page. There, written in careful handwriting, was the conversation he would one day begin. It was not a speech. It was not a warning. It was simply the exact words that had opened everything. At exactly 8:17 on a rainy Tuesday evening, call the old apartment. When the younger you answers, don't begin with impossible claims. Start with something small. Tell him about the blue ceramic mug beside the sink. Curiosity opens doors that certainty only closes. Tommy laughed quietly. The first mysterious sentence had not been chosen because it was dramatic. It had been chosen because it was believable enough to keep him listening. Beneath the script appeared one final note. "There is one thing I never told you because you had to discover it yourself. None of us invented the phone calls alone. Every person you met carried one small part of them forward. The elderly woman kept a promise. Ethan protected an envelope. The boy waited on a bench. The unknown woman reminded you to be patient. Grandpa taught you what to notice before any of us understood why it mattered. You thought you were solving a mystery. In reality, you were inheriting a tradition of trust. Tommy placed the papers on the table and looked around the apartment. Nothing had changed. The bookshelf was still dusty. The blue mug still rested beside the sink. Rain still tapped gently against the window. Yet everything felt different because he was looking at it differently. His mobile phone vibrated. It was an ordinary calendar reminder he had created years earlier and forgotten. Visit Grandpa. Tommy frowned. He had never deleted it after his grandfather passed away. For years it had seemed like a painful mistake. Today it felt like a gift. Instead of deleting the reminder, he picked up his keys and drove to the small hill where his grandfather was buried. The cemetery was quiet beneath a clearing sky. Tommy stood before the simple headstone for several minutes without speaking. Then he remembered the sentence from the lighthouse. People think the greatest mysteries are hidden in places. They aren't. They're hidden in moments that nobody realizes are important until years later. He smiled. I finally noticed, he whispered. As he turned to leave, he saw a father kneeling beside his young daughter a few rows away. The little girl held a disposable camera and was trying to figure out how to use it. The father laughed softly and showed her where to place her finger before stepping back into the frame. Tommy hesitated. Then he walked over. Would you like me to take the picture? He asked. The father gratefully handed him the camera. Tommy looked through the tiny viewfinder. The father rested a reassuring hand on his daughter's shoulder. For a brief second, the scene reminded him of another afternoon, another camera, another hand on a shoulder beside an old lighthouse. He pressed the shutter. The click sounded wonderfully ordinary. He returned the camera, wished them a pleasant day, and walked toward the cemetery gate. Behind him, the father thanked him once more, but Tommy simply waved without turning around. Some moments, he now understood, were not important because they were extraordinary. They became extraordinary because someone chose to pay attention. 20 years later, on another rainy Tuesday at exactly 8:17 in the evening, a 58-year-old Tommy Brown lifted the receiver of an old landline telephone. Smiled at the familiar sound of the connection opening, and said the first sentence exactly as it had once been said to him. Tommy, he said warmly, I'm relieved you finally answered. The circle was complete, not because time had repeated itself, but because kindness, patience, and careful attention had found their way back to where they had always belonged.